Right, week one of fantasy football has come and it has gone, and it brought a lot of joy and excitement like it does every single year. But on top of that, it came with a lot of heartbreak and ended up feeling like a fever dream as so many stud wide receivers gave us absolutely dud performances. But let's not overreact here. We just have one total week in the book, a small sample size. So you know what we're going to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, every single relevant wide receiver in the NFL for week 2 of the 2024 fantasy football season. And I'm going to let you know who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. Like I said, every player, every matchup. Let's break it down. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place that you want to be this season if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. All of their week 2 pick'ems will be going live as the week continues to progress. And if you guys want to claim a free pick'em, Josh Allen over half of a total yard before Thursday night football, you can claim that free pick'em with promo code DCatch. That link is down below. If you guys are watching this video after Thursday, don't worry, you will still get a free pick'em going into Sunday's action as well. And on top of that, you are going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash you can use on Underdog. Pair any pick'em you want with that free Josh Allen pick'em heading into Thursday night football. Automatically double your cash. Let's start with Thursday night's matchup with the Bills traveling to face the Dolphins in Miami. Should be a good offensive day for both teams. I tend to kind of try to stay away from Thursday night matchups, but ultimately I think this one's going to be too fantasy relevant to ignore. Looking at the Bills wide receivers, Keon Coleman had the most targets and most receptions of any Bills wide receiver in week 1. We knew going into the season this was going to be a little bit of a shaky situation. How do we evaluate each of these guys? The new kind of offensive look, no more Stephon Diggs. And ultimately, I think this offense is still going to have a lot of Josh Allen vulturing touchdowns from just about everyone who's relevant on this offensive roster. But still, Keon Coleman, I had him as a deeper flex going into last week. He finished the day with 9.1 fantasy points. Didn't quite hit the double-digit mark, but the highest volume overall for any wide receiver in that week 1 matchup. So I'm still okay with Keon Coleman if you need to flex him. Khalil Shakir, low volume in week 1, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 42 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So he did hit the double-digit mark at 13.2 fantasy points. I think deeper formats, if you need a flex, Khalil Shakir is okay, but I don't really see myself going out of my way to start Coleman or Shakir in week 2. Then looking at the other 2 options here, Curtis Samuel, just 2 targets, 2 receptions, 15 receiving yards, 3.5 fantasy points. He's a stay away for me. I know Mac Hollins scored the touchdown, 10.5 fantasy points, but just 2 targets, 2 receptions, including the receiving touchdown. You take the touchdown away here, there's really nothing there for Mac Hollins. I know you could argue the same for Shakir, but I think he's just going to be more relevant in this offense as the season goes on. So I'm okay with Coleman and Shakir, but don't really see myself going out of my way to start them. On the other hand, for the Dolphins, Tyreek Hill, arrested, detained, whatever it was on the way to this game. He likes to drive cars very fast. He also likes to run with the football in his hands very fast into the end zone. 26 fantasy points. It just seems like Tyreek Hill can have 26 kids in real life, do whatever he wants in real life, but he's still going to be out there putting up double-digit fantasy points week in and week out. Doesn't matter who he faces. He's a must-start wide receiver no matter what. Then Jalen Waddle got banged up early in this game, but was able to come back in. He had 5 targets, 5 receptions, 109 receiving yards, 21.8 yards per catch, 16.2 fantasy points. Jalen Waddle is another wide receiver that you need to start week in and week out. Malik Washington, rookie wide receiver, was not active for week 1. No reason to look his way in fantasy, and literally no reason to look at any wide receiver on this team other than Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle moving into week 2. But Hill and Waddle are absolute must starts, really regardless of who they are facing. All right, moving along to Sunday's action. We've got the 49ers facing off against the Minnesota Vikings. At the time I'm recording this, I will say Monday Night Football has not been played yet. So if Brandon Ayuk looks awful, or, Debo Samuel gets hurt in this game, I'll drop a comment down below and pin it. I'm sorry, all that stuff. But for now, I just think Debo, Brandon Ayuk, where you drafted them, really, regardless of matchup, you're going to start them. I know the Vikings defense looked good in week 1, but they were facing Danny Dimes and the Giants. We expected them to look good. The secondary was still overall pretty allowing to fantasy wide receivers, so I don't see any reason to sit Debo or Ayuk going into week 2. And honestly, even if Debo or Ayuk struggle in week 1, a lot of us are expecting that because they're facing the Jets. Then Ayuk's probably going to be on somewhat of a snap count. So don't overreact too much unless one of these players gets hurt. Then we can pivot here. But for the most part, I think you guys are going to be starting Debo and Ayuk in a lot of lineups in week 2. Jawan Jennings is probably going to be a sit for me unless he goes absolutely off on Monday Night Football. Then maybe we could talk about it. But I think for the most part, he's probably going to be a sit. Moving along to the Minnesota Vikings wide receivers, Justin Jefferson, another guy, just week in, week out. We know we're starting Justin Jefferson regardless of matchup. Plus, Sam Darnold looked pretty good in week 1 overall. So I'm not too worried. I mean, maybe things change against this 49ers defense, but still, JJ, a player that you just have to start. I think we all know that. 6 targets, 4 receptions, 59 receiving yards, 8 touchdown, and 14.7 yards per catch in week 1. Jordan Addison, I liked in week 1, and the thesis was there. Good matchup. I don't think Sam Darnold is going to be as bad as some people expect. And he was having a good game. 4 targets, 3 receptions, 35 receiving yards, 11.6 yards per catch, but he re-aggravated that ankle injury. Some reports are saying it's not that serious, but man, I for those of you who are hesitant on starting or flexing Jordan Addison in week 1, this was the main reason why. And at this point, I'm with you guys now. It's too worrisome to start Jordan Addison. Maybe if he gets the healthy check for the week and he's suited up, you could flex him in a desperate situation. But at this point in time, I don't really feel good about it. Then we had Jalen Naylor score a touchdown in week 1. But that was his only catch of the game. 1 reception, 21 receiving yards, a touchdown, 9.1 fantasy points per game. Some people looking at him, though, because if Addison's going to miss time, well, then maybe he will be a bigger part of this offense. For me, let's see at first. Maybe he's worth a waiver add in deeper leagues, but overall, I'm going to sit Jalen Naylor moving in to week 2. Next up, we've got the Seahawks traveling to New England to face the Patriots. And that Patriots defense did not look bad in week 1 against the Cincinnati Bengals, but they still gave up a double-digit performance to Jamar Chase at the end of the day. So I'm still okay with starting DK Metcalf, a player who you probably have to start anyways based on draft capital. He had 4 targets, 3 receptions, 29 receiving yards in week 1. So not a very impressive performance out of Metcalf in week 1. Geno Smith at times looked really bad. I mean, the amount of safeties in that matchup against the Broncos was blowing my mind. He threw a pick, but it's still at 18 fantasy points, but I don't know. I mean, he threw for a touchdown, ran for a touchdown, only threw 171 total passing yards. So kind of in a weird place with the Seahawks, but it's just week 1. Let's try not to overreact. I think you're still starting DK Metcalf for now. JSN, I expected more out of in this week 1 matchup, and it just wasn't there. 2 targets, 2 receptions, and till we see something out of JSN. I mean, this looked like the JSN we got last year and not the kind of breakout year 2 wide receiver that we were looking for. So kind of staying away from JSN for now. I know Tyler Lockett had the best fantasy day out of any Seahawks wide receiver. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 77 receiving yards. Looked like him and Geno Smith still have nice chemistry. Don't get me wrong. I know maybe it's unfair to say to sit Tyler Lockett based on week 1, but let's kind of see this become a consistent pattern first. Not ready to throw him into starting lineups. He's nothing more than a flex anyways. If you're in a deep enough league, maybe you could flex Lockett, but I just want to see this wide receiver room go for a couple more weeks until we get a more clear answer. So for now, I'm just going to start DK Metcalf. And talking about not having a clear answer on a wide receiver room, we have the New England Patriots wide receivers, and I have got every single wide receiver here as a sit. Looking at week 1 with Jacoby Brissett at quarterback, we had 6 targets for KJ Osborne, 3 receptions, 5.1 fantasy points. Jalen Polk, just 1.6 fantasy points. Tyquan Thornton, 4.7 fantasy points. Keyshawn Butte had no snaps. Demario Douglas 3.2 fantasy points. So I want nothing to do with this wide receiver room. I expect the Seahawks defense to play well in this game like they did in week 1, not discrediting the Patriots defense, who also looked good in week 1. I actually like both the defenses overall in this matchup. So for me, it's just DK Metcalf due to draft capital and him being the wide receiver 1 on this team, who we are starting moving into week 2. Next up, we have the Giants at the Commanders. An interesting matchup here because we know we have 2 really bad defenses, 2 really bad secondaries at hand here. So I think starting Malik Neighbors in week 2, perfectly fine. He was a low-end flex in week 1. 11.6 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 66 66 receiving yards, 13.2 yards per catch. They're at home. They're playing from behind. We know the Vikings secondary is bad. Still want more out of Neighbors. I don't know how high the ceiling is going to be for Neighbors. This was my argument for kind of staying away from him at his ADP in drafts, but I think the floor is definitely going to be there due to targets. It's just, we got Daniel Jones at quarterback. I don't know what to expect, but Malik Neighbors, I think you're still starting and definitely a good flex option against this really bad Washington secondary. That brings me to Randall Robinson, who I think has flex opportunity in this matchup because overall, I mean, we just saw this secondary get torn to pieces last week. Even rookie Jalen McMillan ended up with the touchdown in that game. Chris Godwin and Mike Evans absolutely feasted on the secondary in week 1. So Randall Robinson, 12 targets, the highest target share of any Giant wide receiver in week 1. 6 receptions, 44 receiving yards, 7.3 yards per catch, 11.8 fantasy points. If you need to, he's a good waiver wire add who you can flex this week. Darius Slayton came away with 4 targets, 3 receptions, 5.6 fantasy points. Not going to be a player that we are starting anytime soon. Then Jalen Hyatt had just 1 target. So for the most part, we're going to kind of stay away from this Giants wide receiver room, I think, for most of the season. But here in week 2, this matchup just a little too good to ignore. I think Neighbors and or Robinson okay this week. Looking at the Commanders wide receivers, this offense is looking similar to an offense ran by Lamar Jackson where, I mean, the wide receiver room, I just don't know how often they are going to really be able to benefit. But I do think there's still going to be opportunity, especially against a bad defense. Let's just say an awful defense like the New York Giants. So I know Scary Terry, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 17 receiving yards, 8.5 yards per catch, and 3.7 fantasy points was really disappointing in week 1 because while Tampa Bay's front 7 has been good, at least going off of last year, their secondary was weak. So we expect a little bit more out of Terry in week 1, especially with the Commanders playing from behind. But wasn't there. I think he'll be okay in week 2. He's definitely got opportunity at home against this Giants defense. Probably can go ahead and just keep him in the flex. Dwami Brown did nothing in this game. No targets. Really surprising with that small chemistry we saw in the preseason out of Jaden Daniels and Brown. Luke McCaffrey had 3 targets, 3 receptions. At least he caught everything, but 4.8 fantasy points. Not going to do it. Then we have Zacchaeus on this team as well. 3 targets, 1 reception. Not starting him. So for the most part, staying away from this Washington Commanders offense. But Terry's okay. And we can go ahead and consider some flex options for the Giants wide receivers against this Commanders secondary. Moving along, we got the Chargers facing off against the Panthers. And I was a little bit worried about the Chargers offense in week 1. Just wanted to see how things would kind of shape out. Got Jim Harbaugh as head coach now. We got Herbert coming off of an injury. So for the most part, this was a stay away game in week 1, but Ladd McConkey comes away with a touchdown, the highest target share in this game, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 39 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 14.9 fantasy points. I think for now, Ladd McConkey is definitely a decent flex. Keep in mind that the Panthers played well against the Saints wide receiver 1 and Chris Olave in week 1. So I don't know if we're really viewing McConkey or Palmer as a wide receiver 1, but ultimately I think there's enough opportunity against the Panthers defense that still looked flat out awful in week 1 that if you need to flex Ladd McConkey at this point, feel more comfortable and I am okay with it. In terms of Josh Palmer, I had him as kind of more of a potential flex option last week, and he came away with just 4 targets, 2 receptions, 15 receiving yards, and 3.5 fantasy points. Let's leave him as a sit until we see something consistent emerge. Forgot to put Quentin Johnston's name on the screen here. He ended up with 5 targets, 3 receptions, 38 receiving yards, 6.8 fantasy points, more points than Josh Palmer. But for me, Quentin Johnston's still going to be a sit. Moving forward, I don't think there's any reason to have Palmer or Quentin Johnston in starting lineups. Then moving over to the Panthers wide receivers, who this Panthers offense might look worse than it did last year. So at the end of the day, while I do expect this offense to improve with Dave Canales as their head coach, I don't know right now. Everyone's a sit. Deontay Johnson's a sit. Adam Thielen's a sit. Xavier Leggett is a sit. And Jonathan Mingo is a sit. I will say Xavier Leggett looked okay with what he was given in this game. 7 targets, 4 receptions, 7.5 fantasy points. I mean, Thielen, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and 7.9 fantasy points. Like, I don't know. Someone's got to emerge. Deontay Johnson still had 6 targets. I don't know if it happens in week 2. This Chargers defense played well in week 1. For now, I don't think this is much of an argument. Just stay away from the Panthers wide receiver room. All right, moving along to the Saints visiting the Cowboys. I'm okay with starting Chris Olave. Yes, he was very, very, very disappointing in week 1. The Panthers found a way to shut him down, even with the Saints absolutely blowing out the Panthers essentially, but still, the 2 targets, 2 receptions, 11 receiving yards, 3.1 fantasy points. It feels really bad, but still, I just think Chris Olave, a player that we're going to have to consider a starter for these first couple of weeks. I know it's tough, but it's just week 1. Let's not overreact. He's still the wide receiver 1 here. I'm not panicked. Rashid Shaheed, a player that we liked late in drafts moving into the season, ended up being a really solid flex option in week 1. I will say, because I've been on the Rashid Shaheed train for a while, and I've experienced the experience with Rashid Shaheed, and it's a little bit up and down. There's volatility there, but that's okay for a flex wide receiver. This offense looked very different in week 1. I mean, I know the Panthers defense is bad, but they were doing a lot of things that I think could definitely positively impact the passing game. Derek Carr looked good. Much different defense here in week 2, but Rashid Shaheed, if you are in need of a flex option, he's coming away with 16.3 fantasy points in week 1. I think Shaheed is okay moving into week 2, even against the Cowboys. Moving along to the Cowboys wide receivers, 13.6 fantasy points for CeeDee Lamb. So, I mean, a little disappointing, especially with the Cowboys blowing out the Browns. But at the end of the day, like, sometimes when you get these big offensive performances, overall team performances, I mean, CeeDee Lamb's just not needed in this, that week 1 game as much as he's going to be needed in a more competitive game script. Plus, still hit double digits. Don't panic on CeeDee Lamb. We're still starting him week in and week out. Brandon Cooks walked away with 14.5 fantasy points, had the touchdown in that week 1 matchup. He's going to be a guy similar to Rashid Shaheed, who is going to be some volatility, a lot of upside, but he's still the clear-cut wide receiver 2 on the Cowboys offense, who came out looking very strong in week 1 on the road against what was one of the best defenses in the whole league last year in the Browns. So Brandon Cooks, I think for now, until further notice, is going to be a good flex option. Jalen Tolbert, just 2.2 fantasy points in week 1. Nothing to discuss here. He's a sit. Moving in to week 2. Moving along to an interesting matchup, we got the Colts facing the Packers. So let's start with the Colts wide receivers. And yes, Michael Pittman's still going to be a start for me. A disappointing week 1 with 7.1 fantasy points, but he still had 8 targets overall. I still expect very good things out of Michael Pittman as the season goes on. And the most important thing is that he had the highest target share of any Colts wide receiver in week 1. He's still the wide receiver 1 here. You're still starting him until further notice on a week in, week out basis. I will note very quickly, the time I'm recording this, we don't know if Josh Downs is going to play in week 2 or not. That might kind of change your view, or maybe even my view, about how we look at some of these Colts wide receivers. But we'll kind of find out as the week goes on. I still think with Josh Downs coming off of that injury, he would be a sit for me moving into this matchup, but we'll kind of monitor that as the week goes on. And for now, I'm just going to full send it and say flex Alec Pierce. I mean, he only had 3 targets, 3 receptions in this game, but there just seemed to be a good chemistry on those 3 targets between Anthony Richardson and Alec Pierce. Walked away with 21.5 fantasy points. He's going to be one of the highest priority waiver wire ads moving into week 2. The Packers defense, I know they were playing in poor field conditions on the road and everything, but that secondary did not look good in week 1 against the Eagles. So I'm just going to send it. If you want to flex Alec Pierce, you don't need to like go out of your way to do so, but I'm okay with it because why not? But once again, don't get too caught up in week 1 performances. Go out of your way to start him. AD Mitchell, 5 targets in this game, but just 1 reception. Very disappointing. Was hoping to see more out of him. He's a sit for now. Ashton Dolan had just 1 target, 1 reception, but it was a 54-yard receiving touchdown. So he walked away with double-digit fantasy points, but that's got to become a clear, consistent pattern. And with just 1 target, I'm not starting Ashton Dolan anytime soon. All right, so we know for the Packers that Jordan Love is not going to be playing in this week 2 matchup at the quarterback position, and we're probably going to get Malik Willis. So I can see a lot of people saying just sit all the Packers wide receivers, but it's still a good system, a good, well-coached offense with a lot of dynamic playmakers. So Jaden Reed popped off in week 1, 6 targets, 4 receptions, a touchdown, 33 total fantasy points, also added a second touchdown on the ground. So at the end of the day, I am all for Jaden Reed still because I think the upside's too high. I think they're going to find ways to utilize him. That ceiling moves down for sure. But this reminds me of last year, like when Aaron Rodgers got hurt week 1 and everyone was saying trade Garrett Wilson right away. He's absolute trash now. And I encourage you guys to hold on to Garrett Wilson because he's still going to be a viable option in full PPR in the flex. And for now, I think Jaden Reed is also going to be, especially because they find unique ways to get Jaden Reed the football. So I think you can still start Jaden Reed, especially since you drafted him a little bit later. He's probably the wide receiver 3 or 4 on your team. I think for now, he's okay. If it's a disaster week 2, we'll come back and reevaluate. But I will kind of agree, I think everyone else is a sit for now. I think Christian Watson really needs like a good, viable option at quarterback to take advantage of his skill set. Romeo Doubs, 9 fantasy points week 1. He has a really good chemistry with Jordan Love. I don't know what it looks like here. Malik Willis and Dontavion Wicks didn't even have a catch in week 1. So I'm going to stay away from the rest of the Packers wide receivers, but don't be surprised. Somebody's going to emerge here. The Colts defense didn't look great week 1. I don't have a lot of faith in Malik Willis. Don't get me wrong here, but like I said, a well-coached team, good offensive system. These are still a lot of really good wide receivers here, but I think for the most part, especially where you drafted these guys, we're going to stay away from everyone except for Jaden Reed, moving into week 2. All right, next up we have the Browns facing the Jaguars. And Amari Cooper was one of those wide receivers who you felt like you were in a fever dream watching. Deshaun Watson looks like he does not care about throwing the football because at any point he can walk away from the game of football and still be guaranteed more money than me or you will ever see in our lifetime. This Browns offense looks like a disaster right now. I still think you need to start Amari Cooper for the most part. This Jaguars secondary did not look stout whatsoever in week 1. Can't get much worse for the Browns than what we saw in week 1. So Coop, if you're flexing him, he's your wide receiver 3 or 4. You might have more options on your bench you feel better about. All that stuff is fine. But I think Cooper, for now, we'll give him another shot. Just don't forget, Cooper had a lot of volatility last year. He only had 6.7 fantasy points in week 1 last year. So Cooper, I'm okay with for now. Jerry Jeudy scored a touchdown. He had 11.5 fantasy points. He had 8 targets. So I have him as a sit because I don't trust Jerry Jeudy at all, but at the same time, I think he's a player to watch. He popped up on the waiver wire ad video because the Browns will face the Jaguars, the Giants, the Raiders, the Commanders, and the Eagles, and then the Bengals in the next coming week. So it's a good stretch here for the Browns wide receivers. You just got to figure out how to actually utilize these guys and for this offense to not just be absolute garbage all year. But Sid Tillman, just 1 catch, 1 target, 1.3 fantasy points. We're not starting him anytime soon. So Cooper, I'm okay with. Jeudy, keep a close eye on, but I don't think you need to start him anytime soon. Moving along to the Jaguars, another wide receiver room that felt like a fever dream this past Sunday, at least for those of you who had a lot of faith in Christian Kirk, including myself. 4 targets, 1 catch, 30 receiving yards, 4 PPR points. Listen, I think Kirk will be better as the season goes on. He's another guy early in the year, always seems to be a dud. 1.9 fantasy points in week 1 last year. Let's keep the faith. I think he's still the wide receiver 1 here. Let's start Christian Kirk in the flex. I think he's fine in week 2. Brian Thomas Jr., a player, as the week went on, I started to say, I think I'm really liking Brian Thomas Jr. against the Dolphins. I think he's going to be a good flex option if you want to put him in. And he had 14.7 fantasy points, same amount of targets as Kirk, 4, but he had 4 receptions, 11.7 yards per catch, and a touchdown, most importantly. This Browns secondary did not look good in week 1, so I think Brian Thomas Jr. perfectly fine in the flex. We'll see how this wide receiver room continues to shape out. Then Gabe Davis, I have him as a sit because, once again, this is just a player I don't trust in fantasy. A little bit more involved, than maybe we thought, but just 3 targets, 3 receptions, 62 receiving yards, 20.6 yards per catch. Very Gabe Davis performance, but just 9.2 fantasy points. So have him as a sit. Maybe he pops off. That's the thing with Gabe Davis. He might have 27 points this week, then 3 following week, then 16, then 4, then 5, then 2, then 20. I don't know. It's Gabe Davis. Keep him on your bench as we approach week 2. All right, moving along, let's take a look at the Jets traveling to Tennessee to take on the Titans. And once again, at the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet. But I think for the most part, unless Garrett Wilson gets hurt in week 1, we're going to start him against the Tennessee Titans in week 2. I will say the Titans played pretty well against DJ Moore, the wide receiver 1 on the Bears, but also Caleb Williams barely threw the football with any effect in week 1, so I have a little bit more faith in Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson as a duo against this Tennessee Titans secondary. We'll point out that, they have a pretty good cornerback 1 there in Tennessee, but at the end of the day, Wilson, I just think is going to be a player that we start on a week-in, week-out basis unless he's hurt. Mike Williams, I think, unless he goes absolutely crazy in Monday night's matchup, we're probably sitting as well. And Malachi Corley, I think, is also going to end up being a sit. Let's kind of sit back and see how this Jets wide receiver room kind of works out. Once again, we haven't seen really anything out of Aaron Rodgers at the quarterback position, what kind of chemistry he has with anyone. So it's going to be a small sample size no matter what. So we'll leave them as a sit. If they absolutely pop off in week 1's matchup against the Niners, come back, reevaluate in the comments section. But I think for the most part, we're just starting Garrett Wilson. Calvin Ridley, a pretty disappointing day in week 1 against the Bears. I thought he would be more of an okay flex option, but the Bears defense had a really, really good day at the end of the day. And, Will Levis just did not look like he was grasping the game of NFL football whatsoever in that week 1 matchup. Through 2 picks, 32 passing attempts, 19 completions, 127 yards in the ground, had a fumble, was sacked 3 times. It just did not look good for Will Levis. But I still think Calvin Ridley's an okay flex. Like if you're in a deep enough league, a bad enough position, I think you could start Ridley at 8 fantasy points. He was targeted 7 times, the most targets of any Tennessee Titans wide receiver. So I don't want to go out of my way to start Ridley, but I think he's okay. D-Hop had just 1 catch, 1.8 fantasy points. He's a sit for me. Tyler Boyd, 4.8 fantasy points. Treylon Burke, 1.3 fantasy points. Let's sit all these guys. The only guy you're even considering starting is Calvin Ridley, approaching week 2. All right, here's one of my favorite matchups for wide receivers in week 2. That's going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers squaring off against the Detroit Lions. In week 1, I had the Buccaneers and Commanders matchup circled. Said start basically every wide receiver in this matchup. And then I had the Lions-Rams matchup also circled. Those were 2 matchups I really harped in on moving into week 1. Encourage you guys to start a lot of players. And I think here in week 2, this is going to be one of my favorite overall matchups of Buccaneers and the Lions. Mike Evans absolutely feasted in week 1 on that awful Washington Commanders secondary, as we expected. He walked away with 23 fantasy points, had 2 touchdowns. Nearly half his catches were touchdowns. Great day for Mike Evans. Chris Godwin, another guy that we talked a lot about in the offseason. And we talked a lot about going into week 1 as an absolute must start. 22 fantasy points, 8 targets, 8 receptions, 10.3 yards per catch, 83 total receiving yards, and a touchdown. Expect another solid week out of both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin in week 2. Jalen McMillan, I know, walked away with a touchdown. He had 3 targets, 32 receiving yards, just 1 catch, 32 yards per catch. So he only had the 1 catch and 10 fantasy points. So the encouraging thing was they were trying to get Jalen McMillan involved for sure. We saw that kind of early on. And then late in the game, they went back to him. But that's the key thing, is late in the game, they went back to him, and it was kind of garbage time at that point. I'm glad they found a way for Jalen McMillan to score. Lots of potential there, a guy to keep an eye on, but ultimately he's going to be a sit moving into week 2. And then I want to talk about the Lions moving into week 2, of course, but I want to talk about their secondary first and foremost, because they looked a little bit better than we expected in week 1, but also Puka went out early in this game. So, I mean, you had really Demarcus Robinson filling in as a wide receiver too, but even earlier on when Kupp and Puka were out there, they looked a little bit better than last year, where they were just absolute hot garbage. But Cooper Kupp still walked away with 32 PPR fantasy points in this game. So I do still feel pretty dang good about Mike Evans and Chris Godwin in this week 2 matchup. Now, talking about the Lions wide receivers, Amon-Ra St. Brown, a dud in week 1. A player who absolutely disappointed, especially in a big, intense primetime matchup where both these offenses were humming. 4.3 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 receptions, 13 receiving yards. But come on, it's Amon-Ra St. Brown. Are you really going to bench him? No, we're going to start him week in and week out. Don't get too torn up. And I know this was an early first-round draft pick. At the end of the day, this is just a player that we are going to start no matter what. The upside is way too high. He will be okay. Don't panic on Amon-Ra St. Brown. Jameson Williams, a player I talked a lot about throughout the week. He was one of my must-start wide receivers, a player who I talked about in our week 1 wide receivers who will dominate video, and the upside was absolutely there for Jameson Williams. It was scary early on with that, what looked like maybe a game-ending injury, but he came back, 9 targets, 5 receptions, 121 receiving yards, 24.2 yards per catch, and a touchdown, 24 fantasy points. This is what we want out of Jameson Williams. He has the ability to stretch the field. He's a big upside, boomer bust type wide receiver. He continues to be a flex option on a week in, week out basis. I think you can even consider him a start in this matchup. We'll leave him at the flex just because of where he was drafted and probably where he is in terms of your roster. But at the end of the day, I think he's another really strong start against this Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary moving into week 2. All right, let's move along to the Raiders facing off against the Ravens. It's going to be an interesting matchup. We got the noodle arm Gardner Minshew slinging it out there to Davante Adams. I don't know how happy Adams is going to stay this coming season, but ultimately he finished with 10 fantasy points in week 1, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 59 receiving yards. So I think he'll probably still continue to be okay in fantasy, but the ceiling's just gone. Where you drafted him, you're still starting him. It's a tough matchup, but it's not like the Ravens secondary necessarily put a ton of fear into fantasy managers' minds in week 1, but that was Mahomes and the Chiefs. This is Minshew and the Raiders, so I don't know. Jacoby Myers, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 9.4 fantasy points. He's still a sit for me. Just not enough there. Close to a double-digit mark. I don't think you really need to start him or try and flex him this week, though. Trey Tucker got a bit involved. 3 targets, 2 receptions, 22 receiving yards, 4.2 fantasy points. Just not enough here for these Raiders wide receivers. We're just starting Adams because the floor is probably still there, and he spent enough draft capital on him that you can go ahead and just keep him in your starting lineup. I mean, still Davante Adams, but it's just looking kind of gloomy there with the Raiders offense. Now, Zay Flowers and the Ravens, on the other hand, I mean, this is a run-first offense. This is a Lamar Jackson-first offense, but Zay Flowers still a very good game in week 1, 10 targets, the most important part. Don't forget, I mean, he was wide open at the end of the game in the end zone, could have added a touchdown to this performance as well, and really walked away with an even better fantasy day, but still had 11 fantasy points. I'm okay with Zay Flowers on a week in, week out basis. I like him a lot against the Raiders secondary in week 2. He's pretty close to a must-start wide receiver this week. Rashad Bateman, 7.3 fantasy points. Not enough there for me. The Nelson Aguilar, just 1.6 fantasy points. We're really looking at the tight end, running back, and quarterback position, taking away most of the value here in this offense from the wide receivers, but Zay Flowers is going to continue to be a must-start until further notice. All right, moving along to the Rams facing the Cardinals. An interesting matchup to evaluate this early in the week. I have to record these videos Monday morning, essentially. So, don't really know what's going to go on with the Rams wide receiver room as we move through into week 2. But I will say, because of how bad this Cardinals defense is, if Puka Nacua suits up and plays, I think you can still start him. But man, I'm really worried about Puka Nacua. I mean, this might be a long-term injury. At the time, we don't have. I'm recording this once again. No results here, so he's going to be tested probably while I'm recording this video and everything. But I mean, it's still Puka. He was involved early and often. He had 4 targets, 4 receptions, 8 fantasy points before he had to exit the game. So I'm okay with Puka because of the matchup, but yes, there's plenty of reason to be very concerned about Puka Nacua right now in fantasy. Then Cooper Kupp, 32 fantasy points in week 1. Puka's hurt. I mean, there's such a high ceiling for Kupp right now, even if Puka plays, because he's still going to be like playing through injuries. So Cooper Kupp against this Cardinals secondary's got to be one of my favorite starts, no matter what the circumstance is, moving into week 2. Now, Demarcus Robinson, I have as a sit, but if Puka doesn't play, I think you can consider Demarcus Robinson in deeper formats as a flex option. 7 targets, 4 receptions, 42 receiving yards, 8.2 fantasy points in week 1. Once again, a deep flex option if Puka Nacua sits, but for me, that's just about it. But this is a good matchup nonetheless for all of these Rams pass catchers. Jordan Whittingham was only on the field for 3% of snaps in week 1, so a player that we were monitoring. Then Tutu Atwell came in at 8% of snaps, but neither player had a single target. It was actually Tyler Johnson who showed up, coming in at 65% of snaps and 12.9 fantasy points, 79 receiving yards. So can keep an eye on the rest of these guys behind Kupp and Demarcus Robinson, especially if and when Puka Nacua is out. But until we see a consistent pattern emerge, all the rest of the Rams wide receivers are going to be sits for me. Now, when we look at one of the more disappointing wide receiver performances in week 1 overall, it's probably Marvin Harrison Jr., because for some of you guys, you drafted him at the end of the first round, and for the rest of you guys, you drafted him at the beginning of the second round. So just 3 targets. I mean, this is not what we want to see whatsoever out of Marvin Harrison Jr. in this offense. This was a really frustrating matchup between the Cardinals and Bills in week 1 in terms of fantasy. But Marvin Harrison Jr. might get downgraded to a flex here, but the Rams secondary wasn't necessarily stout in week 1. So I think you can still definitely consider Marvin Harrison Jr. a strong flex this option. But the panic level for me after week 1, I'm not trying to overreact, but I'm just like, how can you not get a first round pick with this type of caliber of more targets overall? I think you still probably have to have him in your starting lineup, even if you kind of downgrade him to a wide receiver 3. I think he's still in your starting lineup as a wide receiver 3 at the worst, moving into week 2. Now, we saw 8 targets for Greg the Torch Dortch, 6 receptions, 11 fantasy points. I'm probably just going to sit Greg Dortch, and Michael Wilson scored a touchdown, 7.5 fantasy points, just 2 targets. So once again, I want to kind of see a consistent pattern emerge. I think there's plenty of opportunity for Dortch and Wilson in this offense, but we got to see it emerge first, and I expect a better performance, more volume out of Marvin Harrison Jr. in the coming weeks. So don't want to overreact here. For the most part, we're just going to flex Marvin Harrison Jr. and move along. All right, next up, we've got the Bengals facing the Chiefs at Arrowhead. This is always a good matchup between these two teams, but let's talk about the Bengals, who were absolute duds in week 1. Seems like they always suck butt in week 1. I mean, Joe Burrow, 8 fantasy points, no touchdowns, a fumble. At least he didn't throw any interceptions. Last year in week 1, he had 3 fantasy points. So I don't know what goes on early on with the Bengals, at least in the last, this year and last year, but I think they'll be okay. I'm not going to overreact here. It's just super frustrating. We expected a better performance at home against the Patriots in week 1, but underestimated that Patriots defense and Jerome Mayo as a head coach. Nonetheless, I don't want to underestimate the Kansas City Chiefs defense. I know they gave up a fair amount of points in week 1, but this defense still looked good, even losing Ladarius Sneed. So, I mean, they just always seem to have a good defensive game plan in place. I still think we're going to start Jamar Chase. He still walked away with 12 fantasy points in week 1, 6 targets, 6 receptions, caught every ball, 62 receiving yards, 10.3 yards per catch. He's not holding out. I think you got to get him in your starting lineups. Now, T. Higgins didn't play in week 1. This is the T. Higgins experience if you haven't been here before. So at least we got it out early in the season in week 1. Listen, I think if he suits up and he plays, you're probably still starting him. I expect the Bengals to be much better in week 2. Expect him to show up, all of that stuff. I expect points in this game. So, yes, T. Higgins, if he plays, I think you can still flex him. If you want to sit him and you have another option we're confident in, I'm okay with that too. Andre Uzavis, a player who just dominated the end of week 1 fantasy discussions. I had people asking if they should bench, players like Jameson Williams, players like Christian Kirk, and I mean, okay, maybe the Christian Kirk one worked out, but I had people really coming in on Uzavis and saying, should I start him over guys I drafted to be viable starters throughout the season? And my answer for the most part was no. I just don't know what we're going to get out of the Bengals. And a lot of times when I was getting that question, we still didn't even know if Jamar Chase was going to play. So it's kind of a stay away situation for the most part for me. And it ended up being a good situation to stay away from. 5.6 fantasy points. Did have 6 targets, 3 receptions, 26 receiving yards, but there just wasn't a lot here. So Uzavis going to be a sit for me. I mean, he tied, he had the same amount of targets as Jamar Chase, don't get me wrong. And maybe if Higgins sits again in week 2, we see better input or output, I should say, out of Uzavis, but I'm just not there. Not enough for me in week 1 to want to start him. Trenton Irwin had 2 targets, the next most targeted wide receiver on this team. Then you had Charlie Jones with 1 target. Jermaine Burton didn't get a single target. I don't think he was active, but he wasn't on the field at all. So at the end of the day, just go ahead and set the rest of the Bengals wide receivers. Then moving on to the Kansas City Chiefs, Rashee Rice, a player that I begged you guys to draft all off season long. I remember the days on Underdog when we were drafting Rashee Rice at pick 72, and people were calling me crazy, saying he was going to get suspended and he's a stay away player and he's a mess. But in week 1, Rashee Rice had 9 targets, 7 receptions, 103 receiving yards, 14.7 yards per catch, and 17.3 fantasy points. He is the wide receiver 1 for the Kansas City Chiefs, and he will be the entire season. That chemistry with him and Patrick Mahomes is not going anywhere whatsoever. When you break down the rest of this wide receiver room, Rashee Rice dominated in terms of volume and targets. The next highest targeted player was Xavier Worthy, who I will still call a start in week 2, upgraded from last week as a flex, and still a flex option that I encourage a lot of you guys to start to a start player in week 2. Now, he's still a player who's going to come in as a wide receiver 3 or 4 in your lineup, but this is why we drafted Xavier Worthy, I mean, just 3 targets, 2 receptions. He had 2 touchdowns, 1 through the air, 1 on the ground, 20 fantasy points. You drafted him to be this kind of volatile, boomer bust, high upside player. And until further notice, until we see a, pattern emerge where he's giving us really bad performances, we're starting Xavier Worthy. The upside's way too high. You look at the rest of this wide receiver room, no other wide receiver had more than 1 target. Juju Smith, 1 target. He's a sit, no catches. Justin Watson, 1 target, 1 reception, 3.5 fantasy points. He's a sit. Sky Moore on the field for 19% of snaps, had 0 targets. Then McCole Hardman not on the field at all in week 1 outside of kick returns. He had 0 fantasy points. So start Rice, start Worthy. Don't look back. Nobody else at the wide receiver position until Hollywood Brown is healthy that we even need to consider for the Kansas City Chiefs. All right, moving along, we got the Steelers facing off against the Denver Broncos, and the Steelers in a weird position. We don't really know, is Russell Wilson or Justin Fields going to start to lead this incredible Arthur Smith offense, who did get a victory in week 1 against the Falcons, but nonetheless, pretty simple breakdown. George Pickens, 13.5 fantasy points in week 1, 7 targets, most targets out of any Steelers wide receiver. So really, regardless of the quarterback situation, at this point in time, I think it's probably going to continue to be Justin Fields. I just think Pickens, a clear wide receiver 1 here. We did see 4 targets go to Pat Freiermuth, who was the next most targeted player on this team, which I expected when we look at this wide receiver room. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is a clear cut wide receiver 1, opportunity through the whole year for George Pickens. Roman Wilson, Van Jefferson, and Calvin Austin only combined for 4 total targets. So start Pickens. It's a tough matchup. So he gets, downgraded to a flex, having to face Pat Surtain, who kind of, locked down DK Metcalf in week 1. But if you need to flex George Pickens, he's fine. On the other hand, we had 12 targets for Courtland Sutton, coming from Bo Nix, so he came away with 4 receptions, 7.8 fantasy points. But he is also the clear-cut wide receiver 1 in a frustrating offensive situation in terms of the Denver Broncos wide receivers. I forgot to put Josh Reynolds' name on the screen, so go ahead and crucify me in the comments, Broncos fans. But he had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 9.5 fantasy points. He was the second highest targeted wide receiver on this Broncos unit. Then Devon Bell, rookie, came in with 8 targets, 8 receptions, 39 receiving yards, 11.9 fantasy points. I like Devon Bell as well as a waiver option, someone to keep an eye on. But until things kind of shape out here for the Broncos and or Bo Nix and this offense, everyone else is a sit. Marvin Mims had just 1 target. It was only on the field for 17% of snaps. So I'm staying away from everyone here. If you need to flex Courtland Sutton, though, I think he's okay because the volume's going to be there. But I do think this Steelers defense is going to look very sharp again moving into week 2. All right, moving along to the Bears facing the Houston Texans. We know that Caleb Williams only threw for 93 total passing yards in week 1, which is very concerning for these Bears wide receivers who should be absolutely loaded at the wide receiver position for the Bears. Just didn't quite feel like that in week 1. Nonetheless, I'm going to keep the faith in DJ Moore. 8 targets, 5 receptions, just 10 fantasy points, 36 total receiving yards. I think DJ Moore is going to be fine due to volume, but we got to get more offensive firepower out of this offense, out of this passing game. Caleb Williams' first start, for the most part, beginning of the week, I told you guys kind of stay away from it because you never know what type of ceiling is going to be presented, and should have stuck with that gut feeling because it just wasn't there. It should get better as the season goes on. It absolutely has to. I think if you absolutely need to flex Keenan Allen, who came out of week 1 a little bit banged up, who knows if he even plays in week 2. He did end up playing through the game, but it's Keenan Allen. I think in deeper formats, you can still take a shot on Keenan Allen, but I would not go out of my way to do so. Roma Dunze, I thought, had some sneaky upside in week 1, and he didn't. 4 targets, 1 reception, 2.1 fantasy points. For now, he's going to be a sit. Kind of worried he might get like a JSN type treatment this season, but I still think there's chemistry between Williams and Roma Dunze. We just got to see it first. For now, I really want to stay away from the Bears wide receiver room outside of DJ Moore. Like I said, in a deep enough format, maybe you can consider Keenan Allen, but that I don't even know if I feel that good about that. Now, looking at the Texans wide receivers, I had every Texans wide receiver as a start last week, and that's just my stance once again. Moving into week 2, I think if you drafted Collins, Diggs, or Dell, you're just starting them. Whether they're your wide receiver 1, 2, 3, or 4, these guys are in your starting lineups week in and week out. This offense, way too much upside. The passing game looked great against the Colts in week 1. This is what we expected. CJ Stroud looked great overall, didn't make any mistakes in this game, threw 2 touchdowns, 234 total passing yards. Joe Mixon, ended up with looking fantastic in this game, ended up with 26 fantasy points. So, we're going to see Mixon get involved. We're going to see some of these wide receivers be volatile. Certain guys score when other guys don't. Stephon Diggs, 2 touchdowns in week 1, no touchdowns to Collins or Dell. Diggs had 21 fantasy points. It's going to be all over the place here for this offense, but we know at the end of the day, this offense is going to be very, very good. Tank Dell, 8.9 fantasy points. I think you still start him. Nico Collins, 17.7. He was a must start last week. I think he continues to be. He's going to be the most targeted, most consistent player on this team throughout the season, is my opinion. So Collins, Diggs, Dell, however you want to look at this, they're still all starts moving into week 2. All right, last but not least, we've got Monday Night Football, and we've got a matchup of the Dirty Birds themselves. We got the Falcons facing off against the Philadelphia Eagles, and Drake London was an absolute dud in week 1. Falcons, Kirko Chains just could not overcome that Steelers defense, and I am worried about the Falcons moving into week 2, but we also know this Eagles secondary was not good in week 1. Now, when we talked about the Packers, I mentioned this, the field conditions weren't great, weather wasn't great, all that stuff in that week 1 Friday night matchup, but I mean, I could see the Eagles secondary playing better at home in week 2 here, but I don't know. I still think Drake London, where you drafted him, you probably need to roll him out in week 2 once again. I do expect the Falcons to get better as the season goes on, but I will say the offensive line performance in week 1 for the Falcons looked really bad and was concerning. This Eagles front 7 definitely going to be stronger than the secondary, I think, as the season goes on, but I think Drake London, you go ahead and roll him out there. Maybe you have enough flex options where you feel like you can bench him, not necessarily against that. But at the end of the day, I think for most people where you drafted him, you're probably rolling him out there. Darnell Mooney, 2.5 fantasy points. We're sitting him. Ray McLeod, 7 targets, 9.2 fantasy points. Maybe he emerges as an option, low-end flex, but for now, I'm just going to sit him. Now, we know what we're doing with A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith every single week. It does not matter the matchup. It does not matter if the 1985 Bears team up with the 2000 Ravens and form a super team and sign Deion Sanders, and that's who the Eagles play in week 2. We're still starting A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, no matter what. These guys are way too talented, way too high of ceilings with way too safe of floors. Don't even really need to talk about it, but A.J. Brown, 22 fantasy points in week 1. Devonta Smith, 15 fantasy points in week 1. These guys will be must-starts week in and week out. When we look at the rest of this wide receiver room for the Eagles, there's nothing. We had 2 combined targets for every other wide receiver on the Eagles, including Jahan Dotson. None of these guys need to even be considered in fantasy football until further notice. That'll do it for today's video. There's every matchup, every wide receiver for week 2 of 2024 fantasy football. Don't forget, if you guys have any fantasy football questions, any format, starts, sits, wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, tight ends, defenses, kickers, trades, roster reviews, whatever it is, drop them down below. I will answer every single question and get back to every single comment on this video. And as the week goes on, we will have everything you guys need for week 2 of fantasy football. Start sits at running backs, quarterbacks, tight ends, must start players, trades, last minute roster ads, all of that stuff. I will have all of those links down below as the week continues to progress. If you guys did enjoy the video, I do kindly ask that you guys hit that subscribe on the way out, especially if today's video was helpful for you. Hit the like, do all of that good YouTube stuff that helps us in the algorithm. And with that, I will say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on the catch.